Seattle, January 1994. Kurt Cobain sat alone in the small room he'd converted into a home studio at the Seattle house he shared with Courtney and Francis. It was 3 a.m., and like most nights lately, sleep wouldn't come. The pain in his stomach was manageable tonight, or maybe he'd just gotten used to it, but his mind was racing with the kind of anxious energy that made rest impossible. The In Utero tour was over, the band was on break, and Kurt had nothing to do but sit with his thoughts, which was never a good thing. He'd been trying to write new material for the past few weeks with little success. Everything he started felt forced or derivative, or just wrong somehow. The pressure to follow up In Utero was immense, and Kurt could feel the weight of expectations crushing him. What do you do after you've made the album you always wanted to make? How do you top honesty? The questions kept him awake most nights, staring at blank pages, waiting for inspiration that never came. Out of frustration more than anything else, Kurt started pulling boxes out of the closet, old stuff from Aberdeen that his mom had sent him years ago and he'd never fully unpacked. Most of it was junk, high school yearbooks he'd never opened, clothes that didn't fit anymore, random knickknacks from a childhood he'd mostly tried to forget. But at the bottom of one box, underneath some old Melvin's t-shirts, Kurt found something that made him freeze. It was a spiral notebook, the kind you buy at any grocery store, with a warped cover that had clearly gotten wet at some point and then dried out. Kurt recognized it immediately. This was his notebook from 1987, back when he was living in Olympia, sleeping on friends' couches, working as a janitor, and writing songs that he thought no one would ever hear. He'd lost track of this notebook years ago, probably left it at some apartment during one of his many moves, and assumed it was gone forever. Kurt opened it with shaking hands. The first few pages were filled with his handwriting from 7 years ago, messier than now, more frantic. Song lyrics, journal entries, doodles in the margins. He flipped through slowly, memories flooding back of who he'd been at 20 years old. Angry, hungry, convinced he'd never make it, but unable to stop trying. Then, about halfway through the notebook, Kurt found something that stopped his heart. There were 3 pages of lyrics he didn't remember writing. Not a vague, "Oh yeah, I sort of recall that," but genuinely, completely didn't remember. Kurt read them once, then again, then a third time, his hands starting to shake. These weren't just good lyrics, they were possibly the best thing he'd ever written. Raw, visceral, painfully honest in a way that even his recent work hadn't quite captured. The words cut straight to the bone of everything Kurt had been trying to articulate his entire career, but had never quite managed to say. The song, if you could call it that at this stage, seemed to be about feeling like a fraud, about achieving everything you'd ever wanted and realizing it didn't fix anything, about being worshipped by millions of people who didn't actually know you and wouldn't like you if they did, about the specific loneliness of being surrounded by people and still feeling completely alone. It was autobiographical in a way that was almost uncomfortable, even for Kurt, who'd built his career on uncomfortable honesty. But here's what made Kurt's hands shake as he read these lyrics. There were specific references in the song to things that hadn't happened yet in 1987 when he supposedly wrote it. A line about singing to arenas of kids who know every word to songs about how much you hate singing to arenas. Another about watching your baby sleep and wondering if she'll hate you when she grows up. A reference to heroin that was too knowing, too specific to the way Kurt currently used it, not the way someone in 1987 who'd barely tried drugs would write about it. Kurt flipped to the front of the notebook, checking the date he'd written there. August 1987, before Nirvana had played their first real show, before Bleach, before any of this. But these lyrics referenced things from 1993. It was impossible. Kurt's first thought was that he was losing his mind, that the drugs had finally fried his brain to the point where he couldn't distinguish reality from delusion. His second thought was that someone was fucking with him, that this was some elaborate prank, though he couldn't imagine who would do that or how they'd have access to his old notebook. He read the lyrics again, and this time he noticed something else. At the bottom of the third page, in the same handwriting, was a note. If you're reading this, it worked. Trust yourself. The music matters more than you know. Don't give up. KC. Kurt felt cold all over. KC, his initials. But he hadn't written that note. He was sure he hadn't, except the handwriting was identical to his, not similar. Identical. Every loop and slant exactly the way Kurt formed letters. He sat there for what might have been minutes or hours, trying to make sense of what he was looking at. The rational explanations didn't work. He couldn't have written these lyrics in 1987 about things that hadn't happened yet. But he also couldn't explain the handwriting, or how this notebook had been sealed in a box at his mom's house for years, or why someone would go to such elaborate lengths to mess with him. The only explanation that made any sense was also the most impossible, that somehow he had written these lyrics, that some version of himself had reached back through time to leave a message. Kurt thought about all the times in the past few months he'd considered ending it, the pain, physical and emotional, that made every day feel like a battle he was losing, the exhaustion of being Kurt Cobain, of carrying the weight of everyone's expectations and projections, the darkness that crept in late at night, whispering that everyone would be better off without him. And here was this note, in his own handwriting, saying, "Don't give up." He read the lyrics again, and this time he grabbed his guitar. The words suggested a melody, and Kurt followed it, letting the song form itself. It came together in about 20 minutes, faster than anything he'd written in years. The melody was simple but haunting, and the lyrics fit it perfectly. When Kurt played it through from start to finish, he felt something he hadn't felt in months. Not happiness exactly, but purpose. The feeling that he'd made something that mattered, that said something true. Kurt spent the rest of the night working on the song, adding chords, adjusting the structure, but mostly just playing it over and over, trying to understand it. By the time the sun came up, he had it memorized. He also had a decision to make. Tell someone about the notebook, about the impossible lyrics, about the note from himself. Or keep it secret, another weird experience in a life full of them. In the end, Kurt decided to tell Christ. He showed him the notebook the next day at rehearsal, explained the whole thing, watched his friend's face go from confusion to concern to something like wonder. "This is impossible," Christ said after reading the lyrics in the note. "I know," Kurt said. "But I didn't write this last week. I didn't write it last month. The notebook was sealed in a box at my mom's place, and look at the handwriting. It's mine, but I don't remember writing it." "So, what are you saying? That you're a time traveler? That future Kurt sent past Kurt a message?" "I'm saying I don't know what I'm saying. But I found these lyrics at exactly the moment when I was thinking about giving up, and they're telling me not to." Chris studied his friend's face. "You've been thinking about giving up?" Kurt looked away. "Every day." They sat in silence for a moment. Then Chris said, "Play me the song." Kurt did. When he finished, Chris was crying. "That's the best thing you've ever written," he said. "It's perfect, and if somehow you sent yourself that message, then maybe you should listen to it. Maybe the music really does matter more than you know." The song became Kurt's secret project. He worked on it obsessively over the next few weeks, refining it, perfecting it, but never quite feeling ready to share it with anyone except Christ. It was too personal, too raw. The lyrics revealed things about his mental state that he wasn't ready for the world to know. But every time he played it, he felt something shift inside him, a reminder that he was more than just his pain, more than just his addiction, more than just the sum of his struggles. In late February, Kurt played the song for Courtney. She listened without interrupting, then sat in stunned silence. Where did that come from? Kurt told her about the notebook. Courtney didn't question it. "You sent yourself a message," she said simply. "You don't think I'm crazy?" "I think you tapped into something. What matters is that you wrote something that reminds you why you do this. Kurt never recorded the song professionally. He played it a handful of times in his home studio, capturing it on his 4-track recorder, but those recordings were rough and incomplete. After his death in April 1994, the tape was found by Courtney, along with the notebook. She kept both private, showing them only to close friends and family. The lyrics were too personal, too prophetic, too painful to release to the world. But the people who heard that rough recording all said the same thing. It was Kurt's masterpiece, better than anything on Nevermind or In Utero. A distillation of everything he'd been trying to say his entire career, finally articulated perfectly. And underneath the words, you could hear something else. Not hope exactly, but a kind of defiance, a refusal to let the darkness win without a fight. The notebook itself became the subject of debate among those who knew about it. Christ remained convinced something impossible happened. The notebook was real. The lyrics were there. Kurt didn't fake it. Courtney had a different view. I think some part of him knew what was coming and left himself a message. What matters is that it gave him a reason to keep going. Dave Grohl, when he finally heard the story years after Kurt's death, had tears in his eyes. "That's so Kurt," he said. Even in his darkest moment, he was trying to save himself, and the way he thought he could do it was through music, because that's all he ever had. That's all any of us ever have. The song from the notebook was never officially released, but bootleg versions eventually circulated among serious Nirvana collectors. The lyrics were transcribed and posted online. People debated the time travel theory, the psychological explanation, whether the whole thing was an elaborate hoax. But for the people who knew Kurt, who understood how he thought and felt and created, the explanation didn't matter as much as the message. That art matters, that music matters, that the things we create can reach across time and space and save us when we need saving most. Whether Kurt really sent himself a message from the future or just wrote something so personal that it felt prophetic, the effect was the same. For a few weeks in early 1994, those lyrics gave him a reason to keep fighting. It wasn't enough to save him in the end. The darkness was too deep, the pain too persistent. But those weeks mattered. The people who knew Kurt during that time said he seemed lighter, more engaged, more present. He talked about future albums, about taking Nirvana in new directions, about finally getting clean and being there for Francis. The song from the notebook had given him something he'd been missing, a reminder that his pain wasn't the whole story, that the music mattered, that he mattered. Today, the original notebook sits in a private collection, seen by only a handful of people. The lyrics remain unpublished out of respect for Kurt's family. But the story persists, told and retold among fans, becoming part of the mythology around Kurt Cobain. The tortured artist who was so desperate to save himself that he found a way to reach through time and offer hope to his past self. Whether you believe in time travel or think there's a more rational explanation, the truth remains. Kurt Cobain found lost lyrics that reminded him not to give up. And for a few precious weeks, he listened. That's not a small thing. In a life defined by struggle and pain, those weeks of hope and purpose and creative energy matter. They show us that even in the darkest times, we're capable of surprising ourselves, of finding reasons to keep going, of believing, however briefly, that the story isn't over yet.